Tonight I want to submit some reflections on the Constitution of Europe, taking advantage of the double meaning of this term, constitution, in most European languages, which in fact is the result of a shared history, although filled, of course, in each particular case with specific experiences. On the one hand, constitution means, of course, institution, or rather the juridical frame and envelope and discourse of legitimation of the institutions, which refers to the state, although not all European states, as you probably know, have formal constitutions, but more generally refers to the public system of legislation and authority. On the other hand, it means a construction, therefore a production. Now, of course, you'll immediately want to ask, production of what? Admittedly, again, the state in most cases, but this time being conceived as a historical organism or body. The classics used to say the body politic, or the political expression of such an organism, which in the case of democratic nation states is usually called a people. But in the case of the European construction, this, as we know, would beg, using that name, would beg the question, or can only work initially as an analogy, and perhaps this analogy is misleading. Perhaps in the case of the Constitution of Europe, the two problems evoked by the term, I was about saying the two aporias or insoluble problems, the problem of instituting or institutionalizing Europe, and the problem of making it or producing its common character, something like a force or power and an identity, are in fact one and the same. But perhaps also they are not, and it is their confusion or their hasty and narrow identification which makes the problems difficult to solve, not to say insoluble, as some vicissitudes of the last period to which I will return might suggest. My thesis, or working hypothesis rather, will be that Europe cannot constitute itself or reconstitute itself in a new shape and in new conditions with different objectives if it does not become more democratic, therefore if it does not democratize itself. I will go further and suggest that it should, in order to constitute itself, invent a more democratic model than any already existing one. That is, democratize democracy as such. These are, I am aware, extreme formulations, apparently assertive, but I want to qualify them immediately. First, I have to readily admit that the meaning of the word I make use of, and there's no other one that could be substituted for it in my opinion, is far from, this time I'm speaking about the word democracy, is far from clear beyond certain very general principles, which are nevertheless compelling, such as the idea of a government of the people by the people, where people, and we're back to the previous difficulty, is not probably so much a historical community, but rather, and tautologically, so to speak, the multitude of the governed themselves. The extent to which the political and social systems in which we live are or have become or have remained democratic is already, as we all know, a matter of permanent disputes. But this is nothing compared with the uncertainty regarding the meaning of the idea of democratizing democracy, to which I referred, and the orientations it covers. In a sense, the widespread expression, and again I'll have to return to it, democratic deficit, which has become kind of a mantra about Europe, is revealing. It says not only that the institutional fabric of Europe lacks certain crucial democratic elements or dimensions, but more profoundly that the idea of democracy in Europe becomes tested and proves insufficient or incomplete. A well-known distinction opposes the problem and the solution, especially in the American or US political jargon. This man is not the solution, he's the problem. But in this case, if Europe is undoubtedly the problem, nothing proves that democracy names the solution. It might be the case that it is itself a problem, or an additional problem. But there is more than that. I will raise the hypothesis against my, what seemed to be my initial assertion, that democratizing democracy in Europe, especially in a critical moment, might in fact create more difficulties, perhaps so harsh that they would lead to a complete blocking of the European construction and eventually to its collapsing. I'm trying not to be pathetic or tragic in my formulations, but in the end, of course, I'll have to return to the idea that, as Rosie also said in her presentation, the moment is critical. This is because it would shake not only many vested interests, both national and transnational, institutional in particular, Brussels, or the commonly accepted representation of its function. But the fragile equilibria, the balances of power, the social and ideological compromises underlying the institutional construction of Europe, its current economic policies, its external alliances, and so on. But more profoundly, this is because of the conflictual element which I believe is inherent in democracy, another very general character or prerequisite of this notion, and which makes pluralism or diversity both necessary and extremely perilous. Excuse me. Democratizing Europe, whatever the modalities, would increase or simply reveal many antagonisms of economic interests, social programs, national and cultural, even religious ideologies, which currently are carefully circumscribed or excluded from the political debate at the European level. Most of the time under the pretension that they are handled as national problems, which in practice means that they are excluded at both levels. I will readily admit that it is precisely this potential conflictuality, therefore the alarming possibility that democratic developments in Europe aiming at resolving the problem of its stalled construction might in fact demonstrate its fragility and possibly destroy it, that explains why many European politicians and citizens who are good Democrats themselves, or even have sincere democratic aspirations hesitate and prefer not to open, so to speak, Pandora's box by raising the issue, and content themselves with what is called, in the last fashionable political jargon, a governance of its multiple tensions, which in practice means a procedure of minimal adaptation of the existing structures, if not a simple surrender to the dominant forces who want to maintain their power or impose their special interests. The peril involved in the idea of democratizing the European construction or constructing Europe through democratization of its own structures is absolutely serious, and I want to take it very seriously myself. But I don't think we ought to remain imprisoned in its, or prisoners of its intimidating capacities or powers. Again, for two reasons, which perhaps are not separable from one another, and to which I will return in various ways during this whole presentation. Let me try and sketch them first in general terms. The democratic uncertainty, or the wager of democracy in Europe, cannot be avoided if we have no choice, except to regress or to progress. That is, if we find ourselves in a critical situation where the existing forms and levels of democracy are threatened in terms of the protection of basic rights, social rights, as well as civil liberties, and in terms of citizens' participation in the government. So that the only way to defend and even rescue existing capacities is to expand them or add new ones, or to reinvent the whole, or reinvest, excuse me, I'm reading my own writing wrongly, or to reinvest the whole democratic capital. This is particularly true if and because, as I will argue again, as I did in the past, national democratic institutions whose effectivity becomes progressively limited and restricted by supranational constitutions, but also by the converging effects of a whole set of causes and influences commonly summarized by the term globalization, are equally threatened by an imaginary return to the sovereign autonomy of the nation, imaginary return to the sovereign autonomy of the nation in the current era of historical transformations of the society and the world in which we find ourselves. Which brings me to the other side. The wager of democracy cannot be avoided if it is the case, as I believe, that democratic legitimacy is the only possible one for political institutions today, not only in Europe, but everywhere. So that the alternative is between a failed political construction of Europe and a more democratic one. The third possibility, say, whatever its varieties, say the oligarchic or bureaucratic one, working from top to bottom, from above, not to speak of the authoritarian, or as I would say, imperial one, which, as we know, was very effective in the construction of many European nation states, is ruled out, being ruled out, not to speak of the third possibility, which is ruled out in the case of Europe, because it could rely only on fears, and there are other outcomes of fear which are more likely than the European Constitution. But as I already argued in the past, democratic legitimacy in Europe means practically more democracy, new forms of expanded democracy, not just a democratic varnish or a democracy that is simply delegated by the pre-existing states and by the same token, in fact, restricted or neutralized, so that France or the Netherlands or Britain or Poland, etc., are or have become democratic states in a fairly reasonable and effective sense. But paradoxically, their common envelope or their joint project in practice is less democratic than they are themselves. Democracy without popular participation and support, whatever the institutional forms, and this is a matter, of course, which is entirely open to debate and an urgent issue, of course, for political theorists, remains a hollow word and is not recognized as such. It is not, I mean, without popular participation, it is not lived as democracy. The peoples of Europe, we may assume, be it old Europe or new Europe, you see which phrase I'm alluding to, will not grant a supranational political system which has to make and perhaps impose decisions and rule in the common interest. Any legitimacy, will not grant any legitimacy to a supranational political system if they don't see it, that is, experience it materially as an increase in rights and powers. That is precisely a new development of their democratic traditions, which is difficult but not impossible to imagine. I know in particular that it raises the issue whether a democratic development of its own belonging to the European Constitution would not automatically amount to a limitation of democracy and legitimacy at other levels, especially the national one. This aporia, which is permanently discussed in the current moment of European politics, and has been so for quite a long time now, might be called the aporia of the zero-sum game. And it largely rests upon the identification of democracy with sovereignty, including popular sovereignty in its classical republican meaning, so that it would not be possible to increase or multiply the degree of sovereignty. It could only become transferred or shared among different instances, that is, divided. I am far from underestimating the reality of this problem, if only because popular sovereignty is such a crucial element of democratic legitimacy, and the transformation of the European constituency into a single unitary European people is such an unlikely, probably contradictory and self-defeating objective. I'm only suggesting that this is part of the problem, to invent a new regime or a new combination of sovereignties, democracy or democratic institutions, and forms of forms of popular participation and legitimacies that would allow for supranational institutions to emerge not as appropriating part of the rights and powers of the citizens previously incarnated by their nation states, but adding to them or supplementing them, while conversely maintaining the essential or the real element of power represented by the national constitutions in a virtuous feedback effect or circle, so to speak. Indeed, this is intelligible only if the whole process is not taking place in a vacuum or an isolated space, but if political, social, cultural processes within the nations and in Europe itself are taking place in a larger world which determines and permeates them, so that to increase one's rights and powers for citizens is also to increase one's capacity to adapt to that world, influence it, and productively exchange with it. Summing up these two elements, which I remind you are still no more than working hypotheses and formulations, I will argue that the issue of democratic solutions to the crisis of the European construction and the issue of democratic legitimacy are, in fact, inseparable. It is only a collective capacity to address the critical issues of the present, to extirpate Europe, and with it part of its environment, from the more and more acute contradictions of its construction, that will grant legitimacy to supranational, that is, federal institutions, procedures, political representations and discourses, cultural imaginaries, and so on. I say federal because I don't want to hide before this fateful term, for which I believe there is no substitute. I'm not suggesting any specific constitutional formula right now, and in fact, I believe that Europe is already a federation in many respects. The issues, the prime problem being how and to which extent it does work as such. Otherwise, the peoples, or parts of them, the populations, if you prefer, especially the most vulnerable parts of them, will return to the pure national and in some cases even subnational loyalties, or rather to its most defensive, therefore also aggressive forms. But conversely, it is only through the invention of new, enlarged, democratic procedures and agencies that a historical crisis of the kind that Europe is experiencing nowadays can be tackled. Because this crisis is not only a matter of surviving a difficult economic conjuncture or resisting the assaults of neighboring empires as a traditional sovereign nation would need, but it is a matter of inventing the actual forms of political agency, the very forms of the political that are needed to adjust to a completely new world in terms of natural environment, culture, communications, economy, and to transform it into a civilized world. Allow me now to return to some issues that had been raised in the aftermath of the negative referenda, or the negative results, the no votings in the referenda on the constitutional treaty in France and the Netherlands, or rather, conversely, in chronological order, the Netherlands and France in 2005, and which the recent developments have not cancelled, much the contrary, and not only because of the Irish repetition, so to speak, of this result in the last referendum on the treaties of Lisbon. We meet again with the notion of crisis here, but in a more immediate sense, more political in the everyday sense of the term. It will be my contention first that the crisis was not created or produced by the fiasco of the constitutional project, but was revealed by the rejections of the French and Dutch voters. It already existed, it was deepening, and could no longer be concealed, or perhaps was accelerated by an irrational and counterproductive attempt at concealing or diverting it. I'm not claiming that the French or Dutch no voters themselves, deeply divided about the kind of Europe they opposed, formed an avant-garde, a vanguard of the European people in the struggle against the so-called liberal or Anglo-Saxon social model, or the imperialism of the global market, or whatever. This was loudly said, particularly by some French politicians, but it is ridiculous, I believe. What is true instead, and was acknowledged by such good experts of European politics as former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, is the fact that if referenda had been organized everywhere, in a majority of countries, the result would have been equally negative. Each time for specific reasons, combining the reactions to domestic political issues and the judgment on the course taken by the European construction, the constituencies had shifted towards a negative attitude, at least with respect to the kind of political agenda that they perceived was embodied in the draft constitution and illustrated by the utterly technocratic way in which it had been framed and offered for ratification. And here is my second contention or claim. I'm not arguing for vox populi, vox dei, the people is always right. But I believe that the immediate political crisis was a symptom of deeper problems which had been and remain ignored. Perhaps a symptom of the fact that in the last years the functions and objectives of the European Union had changed without clear notice, perhaps as the globalization process passed the threshold after the end of the Cold War. Probably the a posteriori contest over the conditions and effects of the enlargement of the European Union to ex-socialist countries revealed precisely that. Again, I do not say that the symptoms clarify the issues at stake, but they reveal the depth of the crisis. This also means that the lessons of the constitutional fiasco become more ambiguous. By itself, it certainly did not give any instrument to restart the European construction on new bases. Still, it could have had a positive effect by forcing us all to analyze the nature of the difficulties and finally ask the essential questions concerning the nature of the political entity that we want to build, reflecting on the forces that can support it inside and outside Europe. This could not be done before because only its development reveals the real nature of the political process, brushing aside its self-image or part of its ideological justifications. This could have amounted to transforming a conjunctural crisis into a collective effort. It is an occasion that I hope, without any certainty, we will be able to catch or grasp again. As many commentators have insisted, the failure of the constitutional project confirmed that a democratic gap or deficit does exist at the core of the current European institutions, which tends to become an abyss, dividing elites and masses, rulers and ruled. This is all the more spectacular because the draft constitution on some points really worked in the direction of adding democratic elements to the European construction, but not on others. It incorporated in particular a charter of fundamental rights into the very notion of the European community of citizens, but did not include in the charter significant new individual or collective rights, not even all those that history had made fundamental, especially the social rights, which I think would have been the decisive condition for the peoples of Europe to view the supranational or federal construction as an improvement on their past acquisitions in the national framework. One it could be worth struggling, if not dying for. The structural democratic deficit cannot be attributed to the enlargement of the European Union from 15 to 25 member states and the corresponding growth of the bureaucracy by itself. It is rather a sign that Europe has entered a new historical era where the European construction plays a new geopolitical and geo-economic role. One of the most obvious aspects concerns the bringing together within one single space of laws and regulations of countries and populations who had been located for a long period on different sides of the great socialist-capitalist divide, therefore do not have the same place in contemporary capitalist accumulation. Finally, it cannot be said, at least I believe, that the democratic gap is simply a consequence of the bad will of the rulers who choose to push their unpopular decisions to the administrative level where they cannot be controlled, again, Brussels, as is sometimes argued, I believe, in a too simplistic manner. Things are more complicated than that. To be sure, there is a perverse effect of the halted or stalled democratization and the mutual paralysis of the federalist or supranationalist, nationalistic and souverainist, as we say in French, or nationalist forces in Europe. It was perfectly illustrated, in a sense, in the draft constitution itself, which, as I have argued in other occasions, led to practically grant a monopoly of political initiative to an autonomous political class having one foot in Brussels and another one in the national capital or local constituencies, therefore serving as necessary and in fact almost unique mediator, translator as it were, between the different sides of power. The considerations concerning the reciprocity of democracy and political practice at different institutional levels are important because they help us interpret the ambivalent effects of the no votes on the European Constitution. On one side, we observed significant developments, long awaited, I would say, but also short-lived, of the citizens' participation in debates concerning the European construction. It could be argued, not only in France or the Netherlands, that elements of the European public sphere had paradoxically emerged on this occasion, even in a negative or rather a conflictual form. But how could it be the case that a public sphere or public debate be not conflictual? On the other side, we observed that the immediate result was rather a decoupling of national political agendas, elections, social policies, budgets, and European common politics, in spite of their being completely interdependent. I must say that I'm especially sensitive to that. Maybe it's a problem of belonging to a certain generations. That was our utopia to some extent 20 years ago, that the intensity of exchanges and debates, conversations, if you like, not only among intellectuals or academics, would grow across the borders. And what I believe, sadly, to be witnessing these days is a lesser and lesser interest of the French for Dutch or Italian or German politics, and conversely. To finish this reminder of the lessons of the constitutional failure, I want to draw the attention to one aspect which also has an immediate global meaning. What the debate revealed, and its aftermath seemed to confirm, was the fact that there remained at least two different ideas or interpretations of the European construction, if not more. It would not be sufficient, I believe, to call them a social one and a liberal one, or a federal one and a national one, because precisely these characterizations do not coincide, they simply overlap. It is not the case that all federalists are social and nationalists are liberals or conversely. And it is also not correct to say that one is more economic and the other is more political, because they are both political and other dimensions are involved, particularly a cultural dimension which touches the way in which Europe's historical identity is perceived and vindicated. I suggested a perspective of transformation of a political crisis into a critical examination, or to take advantage of a dramatic clash of political orientations in order to reveal more lasting structural reasons, looking directly into this problem or this permanent crisis that is Europe, since, I repeat, Europe is a problem, not a solution, or it will work as a solution for some of the issues of globalization only if it is recognized as a problem itself. The problem comes in particular from the fact that our constitutional tradition poses as a democratic axiom that conflicts and struggles should take place after the juridical and political order has been established, within its framework and following its universally or commonly accepted rules, in order to avoid extreme forces and extreme antagonisms to prevail. But this is not, and probably will never be, the case for Europe, whose very identity as a political construct remains at stake in its internal conflicts. A political system whose nature and goals are permanently at stake in its internal struggles, with economic, social, and cultural dimensions over-determining each other. This is the exceptional, uneasy, and unstable character of the European construction, which seems to make it both necessary and impossible to write a constitution for it. But after all, if we look back to the history of European nation-states such as France, Germany, Italy, and even Norway and Sweden, whose peaceful separation took place exactly 100 years ago, we can see that such instabilities were, I've lost a page, were the rule and not the exception. I want now to try and indicate, this will be my final point, rather schematically, two domains in which I believe that struggles for and conflicts, struggles for the democratization of democratic citizenship are present. As many of us, I became aware of their importance through actions and debates in which I was involved personally. I do not claim that their list is sufficient, exhaustive, far from. And I'm also aware that they are not entirely separable, but continuously interfering and overlapping. First, I want to return even briefly to the crucial debate over exclusion, which has been activated by conflicts in the north and the south over the last years, sometimes violent. Arriving in this country from my own country, that is France, I'm of course reminding that this was particularly the case during the riots in the popular neighborhoods called in French the banlieue in November 2005, which some have considered genuine uprisings, although in a contradictory or hesitant form. At the time, my colleague and friend Robert Castel, who is arguably the major figure of French sociology on the left today, published an article called Negative Discrimination, which now has become a book with the same title, in which his initial formulations are partially transformed, and this was the result of conversations which a number of us had after the publication of his article. Initially, at least, Castel would write that the category of exclusion was inadequate to describe the situation of jobless youngsters, mostly of migrant, that is African and North African origin, but also mostly with French citizenship or nationality, who fought against the police. Castel would write, I quote, "No more than the banlieue is a ghetto, the young denizen of the banlieue is excluded." This is my own quick translation. If you give the notion a precise sense, exclusion strictly means a division of the population into two separated categories, whereby the excluded would be external to the social game because the excluded, they enjoy none of the rights, the capacities, and the resources which are necessary to play a role in collective social life. Youngsters in the banlieue are entitled to several prerogatives which go along with belonging to the French nation: political citizenship and social citizenship. Independent of their ethnic origins, most youngsters in the projects of the suburbs are French citizens, therefore granted in the principle the political rights and the equal treatment by the laws, at least when they reach the age of franchise. And of course, and by the way, if they are French citizens, they are also European citizens, formally speaking. So following Castel's initial formulation, young French citizens of immigrant origin would not be excluded in the strict sense, also because they partake in the rights which together form the social citizenship added by the welfare state to a mere civic type of citizenship, a protection against major social risks granted by the law. This led Castel, at the risk of misunderstanding that he acknowledged himself, to adding that compared with the situation of starving populations in many places of the planet, and I would add also populations under various forms of colonial or neo-colonial rule, theirs remained a relatively privileged situation. The young French of recent migrant descent were also not radically excluded culturally. They would rather share in the specific culture which constantly interferes with the dominant culture, albeit in a political manner. In short, they would not be located outside the system. I carefully avoid to say anything about similar situations that can be found in this country because I'm not an expert. This argument was not meant to underestimate the deep social roots of endemic unrest in the banlieue. It simply rejected loose and inflationary uses of the category of exclusion, which suggests that the social and political situation in France today is a mere reproduction of the old colonial opposition between the colonizer and the colonized. However, in our discussion, my objection, also raised by others, of course, largely based on Castel's reference, symptomatic reference, I would say, to the case of women, which I took to be revealing and symbolic, was the following. I don't have the time to quote the reference. Some 20 years ago, French feminist and philosopher Geneviève Fraisse had published a book in which she coined the expression exclusive or exclusionary democracy. Maybe this is used also by others in other countries. She would describe a situation which could be traced back to the political and cultural conflicts of the French Revolution around the relationship of the sexes, but which concerned also the present, and not only the old times, before women were officially awarded full political citizenship or franchise. The fact that for a very long period after the creation of Republican institutions, the rights had been legally restricted for women, that is, their citizenship had remained passive, has left a deep trace, especially in the form of rigid distinctions between the public and the domestic sphere, and a practical impossibility for women, if not to vote, at least to act as representatives of the people in the political institutions and to share the capacities of government in social life in general. I'm summarizing from Fraisse. It would still be the case today if it were not for a permanent struggle, which in a sense is never ended. In that sense, the category of exclusion, not an external exclusion, as Castel seemed to suggest initially, but an internal exclusion, is legitimate, I believe, and indeed necessary, because it does not describe a formal juridical status, but the concrete articulation and the combined effects of certain representations, social conditions, and political practices. Official rights do exist, but what matters in the end is the full empowerment in the sphere of public agency, debates, and conflicts. It is in this sense that I used myself an extended version of Hannah Arendt's notion of the right to have rights, everybody knows, in order to designate the active capacity to claim rights in the public sphere, or dialectically, not to be excluded from the right to vindicate rights. This is, however, what becomes sometimes highly problematic, not to say impossible, unless you recur to forms of anti-institutional violence to impose recognition or to force the door, the gate opened, whose result can be, or perhaps inevitably becomes counterproductive in a given relationship of forces for those groups who are subjected to the combined effects of class discrimination and race discrimination. I argued, however, in response to some simplistic post-colonial analyzing which rightly stressed the powerful effects of that combination, race and class, that even if the combined discriminations of class and race in the Republican French space illustrate the lasting consequences of the colonial oppression of the non-European other, long after he or she has become part of the European population, the category of the excluded cannot become indiscriminately generalized and, so to speak, globalized. It remains a fundamentally heterogeneous category in this sense that there are global exclusions and local exclusions which are not exactly the same, but quite often the migrants and their descendancy find themselves precisely at the juncture of these different local and global forms of exclusion. Nevertheless, you can become excluded from the public sphere today because you are an object of coerced mobility, a migrant, for example, and you can be excluded because, on the contrary, you are, so to speak, an object of coerced immobility, which is the case of many national poor. I want to continue and finish by alluding to another crucial dimension, which in a sense continues the discussion of exclusion, but on the other side, the side of inclusion, concerning the issue of social rights and their political importance as components of democratic citizenship. What strikes me when looking retrospectively at this great debate of the 20th century in the field of political philosophy is the fact that the opposition between the two camps has been, in a sense, settled by history, but only in what we might call a negative manner. The controversy was waged between a socialist, but above all, evolutionary or progressive conception, and a liberal conception which has also progressively rallied so-called third-way theorists. At stake was not whether social rights and protections should be incorporated into legislations, but whether they should be considered basic rights or fundamental rights, on a par, say, with habeas corpus or freedom of thought and expression, that is, become considered normative foundations for the political order itself, or the constitution in one of the meanings of the term. And therefore it was not only a debate concerning the content of specific social rights, such as Medicare, education, protection against the effects of joblessness and homelessness, birth control, etc., but a debate concerning the emergence of what T.H. Marshall, in his famous 1948 essay, Citizenship and Social Class, described as a new stage, in the history of the institution of citizenship, beyond the previous guarantee of civil rights and the emergence of universal franchise within national boundaries. Marshall's conception suggests that the realm of universalistic rights is open to new developments, so that it should be considered incomplete and open at a given historical moment. We should not forget, however, that Marshall's position arguing for a new figure of democratic citizenship arising from the half a century ago, from the incorporation of a multiplicity of social rights into a single legal system, was the result of an intense political and philosophical struggle which took place in Europe, particularly in Britain, but not only, at the end of World War II. There were two antithetic positions, broadly speaking, on the issue of the protection of workers against the excesses of capitalism, so brutally illustrated by the Great Depression. One of them relied on the traditional notion of assistance to the poor, with the society helping its most disadvantaged part. Another one triumphed, perhaps provisionally, in fact, provisionally we can observe now, with the Beveridge Plan, and was incorporated into the principle of the social democratic parties, albeit never completely granted constitutional value, which would see, another conception, which would see social rights as personal rights of the citizen as such, which therefore held for everyone and should be considered a public obligation on the side of the state. Instead, therefore, of a system of private or public charities to provide a minimum of shelter, food, education, and health services to the needy, this amounted to defining the same social rights for everyone based on the assumption that each individual potentially partakes in social activities, so that to be a beneficiary of welfare is not an exception or a stigma, but a normal situation for any working member of the community, which also helps to explain why this progress or evolution in the direction of the universalization of rights was paid for, so to speak, by a restriction to a purely national framework. Social citizenship, as theorized by Marshall and others, and to some extent implemented in Western European states, became inseparable from what I have called in other places the rise of the national social state, today, as we know, under permanent attack from neoliberal forces. On the other side of the ideological divide, precisely, the liberal conception in the classical sense saw social rights and a fortiori the idea of social citizenship not only as catastrophic from the economic point of view, because it would limit the sovereign operations of the market, interrupt the virtuous self-regulations of competitive economic behavior, but also encroaching on individual liberties in the name of the reduction of inequalities. The conclusion was not always that you should ignore social demands, but that you should absolutely distinguish social rights from the proper political level, that of the constitutional expression of human rights in general. But the philosophical lesson not deprived of political consequences is, I believe, a paradoxical one. The issue of social rights has become de-essentialized, but it has also become radically politicized. This is a strange development, in a sense, of Hannah Arendt's argument concerning the relationship between the political institution of citizenship and her politics and her vision or own conception of politics and the political sphere. As we know, she was absolutely opposed to the idea that social rights are political in the strong sense of the term, and in that sense she was not only a Republican but also a liberal. But the contemporary experiences of the politicization of the issue of social rights open the possibility of applying Arendt's motto of the right to have rights beyond her own personal ideology. We may develop the following idea, I suggest. When the dismantling of social rights or welfare reaches the level of generalized social insecurity, many individuals find themselves in a double-bind situation where they are at the same time interpellated as political subjects and internally excluded from the possibility of active political participation. The political rights themselves degenerate, and the substance of citizenship, particularly the reciprocal relationship between obligations for the governed and accountability of the governing, becomes virtual, if not simply denied. This, it seems to me, entirely confirms what Jacques Rancière, on his side, in his recent essay, Hatred of Democracy, now translated into English, La haine de la démocratie, suggested in terms of democracy being, in fact, a process, a permanent struggle for the democratization of its own historical institutions. It shows that there is no such thing as a consensus on democracy. Actual democracy is of necessity based on conflict. It is conflictual democracy, even if there must be a distinction between political conflict and civil war, or as Chantal Mouffe puts it tentatively, between agonism and antagonism, the political adversary and the interior enemy. To conclude in a very tentative manner, I would suggest that such issues as internal exclusion or the struggle around social rights not only are interdependent politically, as they are also dependent from others concerning civil rights, the difficult equilibrium between individual liberties and protections from insecurity, or issues concerning education and the possible invention of an economic model whose capacity would rest upon the upgrading of technical skills rather than the use of cheap labor force. But they can be tackled today only at a coordinated level that is both national and European, or if you like, federal. Therefore, they raise with more urgency the question of political debate, political participation, political antagonism, or as Mouffe prefers to say, and in fact after Foucault, agonism, at the level of the European public sphere itself, reaching the individuals in their neighborhood and local constitutions and extending until the level of central European institutions. This is the practical meaning of my title, Europe, Democracy or Nothing. If we agree to assume that the symptoms of the latent European crisis, which sometimes, as in 2005, and again more recently, emerge in the forefront and disturb the normal governance of the institutions are not only to be read or interpreted in terms of geopolitics, where Europe faces the difficulty to act as a single protagonist between the empires with, again, sufficient legitimacy or sovereign power, but also and above all in the vicious circles created by the lack of legitimacy of political representations, the rise of populist ideologies which easily turn into racism and xenophobia, and the uncertainties about Europe's originality in the process of globalization, which is a matter of cultural identity, but also social and economic model. We should, I believe, take very seriously the issue of democratization, not agitate ready-made formulas, but continuously investigate and discuss the problem itself, within and across borders. To say that Europe is a fragile construction is, I am convinced, below the level of the difficulty. The political construction of Europe is nothing irreversible. Therefore, it remains permanently, as I argued a moment ago, in the critical state where its future depends on renewed choices and decisions. No historical construct is irreversible, not even the nation states, and even less supranational constructions, which are now apparently more necessary than ever. It was not the case of, I know that the comparisons are, in a sense, provocative. It was not the case of the colonial empires. It was not the case either of the Soviet Union, of socialist republics. I would not satisfy or fool myself with the idea that these constructions proved unviable and reversible more or less rapidly because they were undemocratic, whereas the European Union is a democratic construction. I would rather say, in order to add to its chances to resist disruption or collapse in its own inevitable crises, and perhaps the most acute of them are still to come, the European Union has to become more democratic, invent new forms of democracy and preserve them, and join other forces in the world that also have their democratic agendas. Thank you.